Wolfgang, it's so great to spend some time with you today to discuss learnings we have made with the product field. And when we created the product field back in 2015, I guess, we didn't know what we can all discover when working with different teams in the visual form of the product field. And if you don't know the product field as visual form, as a sense-making framework yet, please visit productfield.com or check out the other introduction video by Wolfgang. It gives you a simple understanding of what the product field is all about. And I will share, maybe the definition, the underlying definition of innovation that shapes the visual form of the product field. And back then, and still a valid definition, we defined innovation as the realization and introduction of something new or something substantially changed, right? And these two core activities shape the product field. So the vertical axis is the axis of realization. Something that is intangible becomes tangible. And on the horizontal axis, we talk about the activity of introduction. So something is moved from the inside, maybe of the team, the organization, the lab, towards the outside where customers and users happen. And these two axes result in the visual shape of the product field, where we discuss 12 different aspects that are commonly discussed when people talk about innovation. So the product field helps to align perspectives, right? And to bring different perspectives on the product in the center together. So we unite in this visual form the viability of an innovation, the feasibility, its marketability, and the desirability. And when we look at organizations, we have different roles, different career paths responsible for these areas, and the product field helps to shape a more complex or holistic truth about the thing in the center, the thing people are working on. And what I found recently, Wolfgang, I'm not sure if you know that, I was so excited when I was reading this book, a recommendation Visual Consulting by David Sibbett. And he refers to the group graphics keyboard here. And it's from 1970s. And they kind of analyzed and researched different types of visualization styles. And they talk about the mandala. The mandala is good for perceiving wholeness, right? And seeing unities under a diversity of perceptions. And this is how we, with the product field, deal with the inherent complexity of innovation. And what we found then is that the form itself helps to kind of connect all sayings, mantras, methodologies about innovation, all the advice that sometimes becomes very noisy you get about product innovation, to gain innovation wisdom. And what we see here, and maybe Wolfgang, I want to invite you. So it's one picture that you introduced. The design thinking process seems very linear in the first hand, right? And maybe a few words about this process and how we can map it to the product field and why this is helpful.
As you say, the process, if you look at it this way, looks quite linear. And in my experience, that's one of the main problems with frameworks like design thinking, that they are primarily understood as a ready-made process that just consists of a series of linear steps. And if you follow those steps, then you get innovation. But if you map what you're doing in these steps on the visual form of the product field, you see what is really happening is kind of a path through different parts of this complex system that is innovation, of the whole of innovation. And using the product field to give that kind of context helps you avoid this misunderstanding that it's just a process that you have to follow, and shows you, okay, this is a path I'm following and I have to make decisions on the way. I need to be clear about what am I doing in this step? Am I really ready to go to the next one? Do I maybe have to go back? And all those circles that also look very simple in the left variant of the process become something much more interesting once you map it to the product field, because you see, okay, so here I have to change subject areas. I have to go from one part of the system to another part of the system. I have to look at places, locations, aspects, people that I haven't looked at before. So it helps you realize, acknowledge the complexity of what you're doing, but it also helps you simplify, because you can focus on where am I right now? What question do I have to answer? What do I have to do next? And focus on the context you're in at each given moment. And if you map it to the product field, what you see is really a path through the product field, which starts with empathize, which means focusing on users, understanding their motivations, understanding the problems they have, and the problems that you can possibly solve with a product. And only if you've understood which problem you want to solve and you could solve, then you define your challenge, you define what you want to design. And that is what then opens the space of possible solutions. So then you go to ideation, which is a highly iterative process on the border between solutions and uniqueness, where you try to find things that solve the problem, that are unique, and that they are different from other solutions, from alternatives. And once you have a first idea what a solution could look like, then you go to prototyping. And prototyping sits right at the border between solution and production and distribution. So it's the first time that you make your product really tangible and have something that you can put out there, which is the next step, which is test. You go back to the users, you try to identify possible customers for the product, and then you show it to them. And you ask them and you talk to them and find out, is that something that's really helpful to you? Does that really solve your problem? Which then generates more empathy, more understanding, and then brings you back into the cycle and into the next iteration of the process, because then you have a clearer definition of what you want to do, what works, what doesn't work, what you have to do next. You can iterate on your idea, you can iterate on the prototype, you can then again test it. And so this seemingly linear process that goes from left to right, that has a start and an end, becomes something circular and becomes a learning process that you can use again and again and again to refine your product and to discover new possibilities.
Yeah, thank you. And what really excites me really is the position of like prototyping. Because when we think about the activities again, like realizing something and introducing a thing into the world, that's innovation. So prototyping rapidly speeds up how things become tangible. And by being tangible, you are able to introduce them or to put them out right into the user hands, like be it a paper prototype or a click dummy or something like more complex, but really it's built rapidly and it's out there fast, and you can, like, it's really on the outside where you test. So whenever you find like a process that seems like very linear or a methodology, it's interesting to kind of like bring these activities, these verbs, these actions onto these axis of like realizing something and introducing a thing, a work, a product.
Yeah, in the same act, basically.
Okay, so this was like a really quick dive into like design thinking, and it's obvious they say like start here, start with the user. And now there are like different, what we call like shapes of innovation, even like mantras and sayings like problem solution fit, product market fit, that we won't tackle today, but we are able to kind of like look at these mantras and sayings through the perspective or through the lens of the product field or through the sense-making framework of the product field. But for today, we just focus on the lean cycle. And Eric Ries made it popular with the book, The Lean Startup. Maybe a few words from you, Wolfgang, about the lean cycle. Yeah.
The lean cycle has, as the name already says, one big advantage compared to these more linear process visualizations, which is it's a cycle. And from the outset, it is designed to show what you have to do is learning. Eric Ries calls it validated learning. That's a huge step forward. And in my experience, that's the most important insight that's hidden in the lean startup methodology, that it makes very clear to people what we're doing when we are innovating, when we're developing new products, is in fact learning. That being said, it's of course a gross simplification of what is happening when we're building products. And if we look at how the framework and how the cycle is usually described, it's called the build, measure, learn loop. And by calling it the build, measure, learn loop, it suggests that you have to start with building. And so a lot of the time when I work with startups that adhere very closely to the lean startup methodology, everything becomes centered around building the first product, prototype, the first MVP as quickly as possible. There's this famous quote, I think it was the LinkedIn founder who said it: if you're not embarrassed by the first version you ship too late. So that's become kind of the mantra for the at least 2010s crop of startups, that you have to build very fast and then you have to iterate rapidly on what you've built first. But that tends to ignore that, of course, when you build the first version of the product, you have already implicitly measured something and learned something. You have some information, some insight that your first idea, that your first prototype is based on. So if you take the idea of the lean startup cycle and the build, measure, learn loop really being a cycle, then you have to be aware of where am I right now and what have I already done implicitly. And if I built the first version, then of course there are assumptions that went into that. And these assumptions are based on data. And this data is probably biased because I only have a small segment of the world that I've looked at, for example. And again, this becomes much clearer if we map the process onto the product field. It's a bit easier here because it is already a cycle. It's already this sequence of steps that repeats itself. First you build something, then you measure how it performs, then you learn from that, and then that informs what you build next. But if you map it into the product field, it becomes much easier to identify what assumptions went into each of these steps and where am I starting with this cycle? Where am I right now? If I'm building something, what has gone on before implicitly, and where did these informations come from, and what am I doing next, and where am I changing the context to, etc., etc.
So when I get you right, so mapping towards a product field doesn't mean like talking about any motivations here, but talking about like assumptions about user motivations that actually made you build the thing. So once you start to collect all your insights and knowledge about your users, whenever you or wherever you are in the process, you kind of like make explicit that the first thing you build is based on assumptions that are like formulated here and are mapped onto the product field, right?
Yeah, I think especially with the lean startup cycle, if you map it into the product field, if you map the explicitly stated steps of the process, then you see what you are explicitly tasked with if you follow this methodology. So for example, if you measure, you usually measure quantitatively. You measure things like click-through rates and sign-up rates and retention rates and stuff like that. And then if you learn from that, you usually build iterations of what you've done before that try to optimize for one of those metrics. And then you measure again. But the step in between where you derive insights from these data, that's largely implicit. There's no clear methodology for that. If you look at courses or blogs or podcasts about lean startup, they rarely talk about qualitative research. They rarely talk about methods more connected to design thinking, for example, that center heavily about generating insights, about deep understanding. And if you map the lean startup cycle into the product field, you see why this happens, because it's taking basically a shortcut. It looks at quantitative data, it looks at consumer or customer behavior, and then you try to optimize your product in order to optimize these how it performs in these metrics. But you rarely spend a lot of time in like thinking more deeply about motivations and what causes this behavior. And that's, and you're right in this, that's why all of this is going into the process largely as assumptions. And making this gap explicit helps you realize, okay, I have to also make these assumptions explicit, not only the assumptions that the lean startup cycle always talks about, which are the quantitatively measurable ones. And then you also see, maybe that's something where something like the lean startup cycle can be complementary to something like the design thinking process. And that's basically where things like the design sprint came from. That you work in a highly iterative, cyclical process that has little space and little time for deeper understanding of user needs, of user motivations, of being creative, of ideating relatively freely. And the design sprint is supposed to give a container for that can be incorporated into an agile development or lean startup cycle-like process.
I'd love to map the design sprint. We can do so, but maybe not this time. Let's map the design sprint onto the visual form of the product field next time. But let me take like one step back. So we have these activities of like build, measure, and learn. And we build, or that's the hypothesis here. We build with code that gives us data. And you were talking a lot about like quantitative data. And based on this data, we develop like new ideas to build the next better version. And isn't it like funny, like this visual form, like just like mirrored, is exactly what makes it, or what connects it to the product field. So the building happens here, and this gives a hint about like how to produce things with code, and only like shipping things built with code allows like this fast, like spinning iteration loop. And like by building the real thing, not a prototype, you're able to collect like quantitative data, the real data. You're testing in the real world, the market, which is more tangible than maybe like testing a prototype in a lab, which allows us to learn. But what you said, you're not explicit about like the why do people behave that way, because you're like not digging into like the qualitative areas. And I'm not sure if we discussed this already, but sometimes Klaus and I talk about this axis as the axis of qualification in the product field. And then we do have the axis of quantification, which is the other like diagonal axis in the field. This is for later again, but you prepared like one chart, which is like kind of like sums up the connection between like lean cycle and design thinking. Maybe for today, we take a look at this chart and yeah, let's see what this graphic tells us you prepared.
Sure. So let's have a look. In this graphic, you can see 3 different paths through a product field that looks slightly more complex than just simple cycles. The red one right here represents the design thinking journey through the product field. The yellow-orange one here represents the lean startup cycle like path through the product field. And that's something that is, again, complementary, which I will talk about in a moment. What I've added here are examples for specific methods you use in each of these steps, which kind of concretize the verbs you've been talking about, the empathize, define, ideate, build, measure, learn stuff. So if you look at the design thinking path that starts with understanding users and motivations, you use stuff like interviews, personas, customer journeys. To gain problem understanding, you use tools like how might we questions to define your design challenge. Then you iterate on your ideas. You use tools like the design studio or the crazy eights. Go into prototyping, which sits right at this intersection, as you said, of realization and introduction. And then you go back to the user to test what you built. And then you iterate through this again and again and again. What you see is that this is kind of extremely well developed in certain areas of the product field, but it barely touches upon others. It doesn't have any real connection to, for example, the goals aspect, or to things like drivers and enablers. And this is where you see that other frameworks, other methodologies can be complementary to it. So for example, if we look at the Lean Startup Cycle, which looks at the heavily quantified data, the measure aspect with tools like pirate metrics, more traditional market analysis, then things like problem interviews to, based on that kind of data, understand what to focus on. That's basically where you define your challenge in this kind of model, and then use other frameworks or tools like the Kano model to define your solution space, test this rapidly in solution interviews, build the famous or infamous MVP, and go out and generate more quantitative data. This is a way to address exactly what's missing in the design thinking framework, which is a strong connection to strategic goals, to business viability up here, and to, as you said, real data, getting out of a lab situation, measuring real customer behavior, and quantifying the performance of your product. So it adds where down here and up here where design thinking has blind spots. And then this blue shape, whatever it looks like here, like a slightly bent check mark maybe, that's an example for that would be OKRs. So any kind of target system that you use to align strategic goals and concrete tasks, production, use of resources in product field speak would be or could be visualized in this kind of shape, where you start with defining goals that have to be driven, make use of certain enabling resources, have to be aligned with what's being built, what part of the solution contributes to achieving these goals, and then this is checked back against the criteria you set out in the beginning. This is exactly what OKRs do. You define the objective, you define key results, and then you check if you achieve these key results and if they bring you closer to your objective. But taken in isolation, this again has huge areas of blind spots, because in and by itself, it doesn't provide you with any insights about the larger context, about the outside world, about consumers, about customers, etc. So the best use you can make of that is if you use it as a complementary tool to the other ones. And if you kind of zoom out a little and like try to squint a little, then you see if you use all of these frameworks, then you touch on every aspect of the product field. And this again goes to show that it's a complex system we're working with. And all of these frameworks, all of these processes are heuristics and toolboxes for you to work successfully in and with that system, but not more. It's not less what they can do, but it's also not more. What you need to do is gain a constantly improving and expanding understanding of the system as a whole. This is where, as you said, the visual form that focuses on wholeness comes in. And then you can contextualize all of these steps to make the best use of the methods that are available.
Wow, awesome, Wolfgang. And it's not about like to complete the product field as a visual form, just to, for the sake of the product field, to touch all aspects of the product field, but to really use this form to tackle the complexity, the inherent complexity of the nature of innovation. And by the wholeness of this form, this helps you to kind of like connect all aspects from different perspectives in a balanced way.
Yes, exactly. And that is, I think, might be a good preview for a few topics we could touch upon in like following sessions, because what you just said, the idea of having a balanced approach to innovation, that's something we could dig a little deeper into. How do you identify the mode that you are innovating in? How can you identify your strengths and weaknesses and the kind of pattern of innovation that what you're doing is exemplifying? And is this balanced, or is it very one-sided? Is it very focused on a certain area of the system while neglecting others, or are you making the best use of all of them? This also connects to questions like, as you said, the qualitative, quantitative differentiation. How do you differentiate between things like the problem solution fit and the product market fit, and how are these different questions you ask yourself in different parts of your thinking process? So a lot of connections to make, to look into more aspects of how the product field can help you gain a deeper understanding of what you're doing when you're doing product innovation.
I'd love to do so. Let's continue with one of these ideas, talking about like balancing innovations. And I have like a few other topics in my mind as well. If you, as a listener to this experiment, this little format, have a question regarding product innovation and how to visualize it, or a specific methodology, like how to visualize it or bring it in the form of the product field, we'd love to hear that and to brainstorm about your question. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks, Wolfgang.
Thanks, Michael. Bye bye.